We had previously noted that the two approaches to the prohibition of lo titein michshol, that of the Torah Kahanim, where the problem lies in the fact that the advice that is given is bad advice, in that it leads to a negative impact upon the health, wealth, and well-being of the recipient of that advice, whereas according to the Rebbe, Rashi focuses his commentary upon the additional law, lo titein eitzah she'ena hogenet law, which suggests that in of itself the advice is not necessarily bad, but rather it is advice that is self-serving, advice where the recipient is not the primary focus of that advice. Hence, the example that Rashi does adopt from the four that is provided by the Torah Kahanim is that of advising an individual to sell real estate and with the proceeds purchase a chamor. In contrast to the three earlier examples from the Torah Kahanim where the advice was clearly bad advice. With example number 4, the one used by Rashi, that advice is not necessarily bad advice. As we noted in previous panels, the recipient might be quite willing to undertake the risks of changing his or her profession and hence sell the real estate. But rather the problem and shortcoming lies in the intent that underpins that advice. Evidence to the problem lies in the fact that Rashi adds to his commentary that fourth line, Ve'ata okef alav, that the giver of advice pressures the individual verbally, twists him to his advantage, and ultimately venotla himeno, and takes possession of the property and that which is not in the best interests of the recipient of that advice. So that according to Rashi, even if the advice in of itself was good, but had a self-serving component, that also comes under the prohibition of velifnei iver lo titein michshol. Accordingly, Rashi justifies the follow-on to this command or prohibition of v'yareta me'elokecha, which in the context of the pasuk suggests that you must abide by this restriction, you must fear God, a statement that is attached to a number but not all prohibitions, and therefore Rashi reads into this attachment a coded message. Commenting upon the words v'yareta me'elokecha, Rashi writes, Lefi shehadavar hazeh, because the fulfillment, the observance of this prohibition is one that is eino masur lebriot, is not handed to or in the hands of other human beings. Leida im dato shel zeh, whether or not the intent of the giver of this advice was letova or lera'ah, was for good or for bad. One cannot read the minds of other human beings, and hence when the advice that was given turns out to have had a negative impact upon the recipient, and when challenged, v'yachol lihishameh, the giver of this advice can shirk responsibility, v'lomar, and respond that letova nitkavant, my intentions were not that the recipient should sustain a loss, my intentions were letova, were good and appropriate, and therefore he or she would not be held accountable for the loss that comes from velifnei iver lo titein michshol. However, within the God-man world, there will be some accountability. And hence Rashi goes on to write, Lefichach ne'emar bo, v'yareta me'elokech. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has added and attached to the prohibition of velifnei iver the words v'yareta me'elokecha, implying that ultimately the individual must be accountable to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, hamakir machshvatecha, who is and does have access to the thoughts and the intent of human beings. This of course is a faith statement. Rashi in his commentary writes, Leida im dato shel zeh letova or lera'ah, a statement that points not to the outcome, good or bad, for the recipient, but rather whether or not the intent underpinning this advice was one in which the recipient was the primary focus, which doesn't always work out the way things should, or whether the advice that was given was self-serving, so that even if the advice in of itself was good, the intent was not for the best interests of the recipient. In contrast, the Torah Kahanim, quoting the fourth example where the advice is to sell a field and with the proceeds purchase a chamor, also adds the phrase ve'ata okef alav v'not lahemeno. You put pressure upon the individual and ultimately take the real estate from him or her. Goes on to write Shema Tomar, and when things turn out not to have been in the best interests of the recipient of that advice, lest you say, Eitzah tova ani noten lo, you can't hold me responsible because I did give him good advice. A close comparison between the Torah Kohanim and the commentary of Rashi is that according to the Torah Kohanim, the issue is not intent but rather the outcome. In other words, V'lifnei iver lo titein michshol, the michshol here is a prohibition of presenting bad advice.